Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me this evening for the 16th episode in the Conversation with Alan series. I'm Alan Locher. I created Conversations with Alan to have open and honest discussions about the rise of hate and the rise of anti Semitism, with high hopes that it leads to conversations that make us all think about our own place in history and what we can all do together to change our country's course to stop hate in every form. Tonight, author and former professional basketball player Dan Grunfeld is here to share the story of his father, a former New York Knicks player and general manager, Ernie Grunfeld, who is the only athlete in NBA history whose parents survived the Holocaust. As a longtime figure in the public eye, audiences knew very little about his background. Dan, in his book, By the Grace of the Game, details what the Grunfeld family had to endure during the Holocaust, how basketball transformed Ernie from an immigrant outcast to an Olympic gold medalist for the United States. If the magnitude of an American dream is measured by the intensity of the nightmare that came before and the heights of the triumph achieved after, then By the Grace of the Game recounts an American dream story of unprecedented scale, from the grips of the Nazis to the top of the Olympic podium, from the cheap seats to center stage at Madison Square Garden, from yellow stars to silver spoons. This striking family saga traverses the vast spectrum of the human experience to detail how perseverance, love, and legacy can survive through generations, carried on the shoulders of a simple and beautiful game, a vehicle no one could have predicted. With anti-Semitism and attacks on Jewish people currently on the rise, I couldn't think of a more important conversation to have this evening. Please welcome Dan Grunfeld to the Locher Room. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Alan, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. We were talking backstage. I wish, these conversations weren't needed, but, it seems right now they're even more so.
Yeah, and we talked about it. It's always there, right? Anti-Semitism, and I write that in my book. Even if it's not apparent to the naked eye, it's always under the surface, and it's the unfortunate reality of the world we live in. Of course, current events have brought it to the forefront recently and has shined a light on it. But yeah, it's deeply troubling and scary stuff.
Have the current events or the sort of the magnitude of some of those messages surprised you, scared you? We did talk backstage. You have two young children.
I'm not surprised, unfortunately, by anything when it comes to anti-Semitism. As you said, my grandparents are Holocaust survivors. My grandmother lost 5 siblings and both parents in the Holocaust. My grandfather lost both his sisters, both his parents. We've seen what hatred, what intolerance, what injustice is capable of, what it can lead to, and I've experienced it personally too, right? And I read in my book about finding a swastika in my hometown growing up. When I was in business school at Stanford as an adult, we had swastikas on our campus. So I've seen it, I felt it, I've heard it. So it unfortunately doesn't surprise me, but it upsets me, especially to see such a public figure say these things. It's so dangerous, right? Because his platform is so big and there are many, many people standing on the right side and speaking out, but there are so many more who are hearing these messages and are internalizing them, and it's really dangerous. And yes, it is scary. I have young kids, and it's scary.
It is scary, and I don't know if it's I said to you, Charlottesville really woke me up. It did surprise me it took Adidas so long. Like that should have happened instantaneously. That should have. What do you think of this? This going around, people. I mean, I appreciate it, but I'm curious your feelings on this.
Yeah, listen, I think that advocacy looks different for everybody, and I appreciate when people, in whatever way is comfortable for them, stand up for what's right. So when I see people who post that, who write that, I appreciate that, and I feel that because they've said to themselves, "This is a problem. I want to stand up against it." There are different forms. You can tell an anecdote. You can, you use your vote. You use your resources. You can say different things. But to me, I'll never underestimate support, right? Or try to dictate how it should come, because we need so much of it. But also we need to give it too. And I talk a lot about that, right? When I talk about my family story in my book, about there was a time where we needed help. There was a time that we needed voices, and there wasn't enough help, and there weren't enough voices, right? So we the Jewish people, need to be voices for others, right? We're not the only group who's discriminated against, who faces prejudice, injustice, racism, right? So we need to be that force for good also.
Absolutely. And I agree with you on that messaging, because every time I have seen it, I have said thank you, whether I know the person or not, because I do agree with you. Any support is a good thing for us. And also, I wouldn't be here without people who risk their lives to save my family.
Listen,
we wouldn't have the conversation tonight. How at what age for yourself did you become aware of the Holocaust and your family's experience? Do you remember first learning about it?
Yeah, from the time I was young, in elementary school, I knew roughly, what had happened. Not, of course, all the details, but knew what the Holocaust was. It was really hard not to in my family, because my grandmother, has a very thick accent, and kids are perceptive and intuitive, right? So like, I knew she went through something really hard. I knew she told stories about family members who are no longer around, and so I always grew up understanding that something really bad and really hateful had happened. And I've always been very sensitive to situations like this, like you mentioned, but not just against Jewish people, against any people. Like, when people aren't treated fairly, we know what can happen, right? And so these things have always been very raw for me.
It makes a lot of sense. And you're very close to your grandmother, who is 97. When did you, I'm sure it's way before you started to write the book, but when did you, what do you remember about learning that she lost both of her parents and her 5 siblings, which is, for anyone to survive the Holocaust alone is a big thing. And then to survive that kind of loss, and the way you describe her, that, her love of life is amazing.
She's an inspiration for everyone. And I've gotten so much feedback from my book, people from all around the world writing me about my grandmother she is a hero. And actually, she is my hero, but she's also a hero. She risked her life to save 17 people. She acquired false documents for 17 people, in addition to herself. And by the way, we talked about needing help and people getting help. My grandmother herself was saved twice by Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, right? Wallenberg is considered one of the greatest heroes of the Holocaust. He saved her twice. So I know, like you said, we wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here without Raoul Wallenberg. But my grandmother risked her life to save others in the way she could, right? So it's just about, humanity, humankind, people helping people. I said, I talked to my grandma.
I knew she saved, some folks' lives. I did not realize it was 17. That is,
yeah, wow. That's how.
So for people who might not know, where did your grandmother grow up?
She grew up in Transylvania, on the border of Romania and Hungary. And so it kind of went back and forth during the war. And when the Nazis invaded, she happened to be visiting an older sister in Budapest. And actually, I'll tell you, there were 2 sisters with her in Budapest, and they got a letter from my great grandfather as soon as the Nazis invaded that said, come home immediately. And so they packed their suitcases. They were ready to go to the train station. The next day, they got another letter from my great grandfather, and all it said was, if you can, stay where you are. And my grandma to this day says it was that second letter that saved her from Auschwitz. She never talked to her father again, who was her best friend and her hero. He was taken to Auschwitz, where he was killed. His name was Solomon Samuel. And as I told you earlier, my oldest son's name is Solomon, after him, right? And so my grandmother was on the run in Budapest. And so she hid and bombed out buildings and, scraped for food wherever she could find it. And it was Wallenberg who issued protective passports. My grandmother was able to get one for herself, risked her life to get for others. But those only protected her for so long. So she was eventually, it was no longer recognized. She was captured by the Nazis. She was thrown in the Budapest ghetto. And it was there that she narrowly evaded a massacre. And it was Raoul Wallenberg who stepped in to save her one more time.
Wow. How old was she during the war?
17. Wow. When this was all happening. Yep.
So those memories for her are so incredibly vivid.
And she has an amazing memory. So the experiences were vivid then, and she recalls them now, honestly, as if they happened yesterday. And so the book has this really rich detail, and that's only made possible by my grandmother's recollections of these moments. And her eyes have seen things that none of our eyes should see, right? She can recount things that happened that you can't even believe. You cannot believe that people have done this to one another. And she was there. And so I talked to a lot of youngsters, a lot of groups of students about the book and about the story, the Holocaust. And I always tell them, we learn about it in class and we hear people talk about it, but it really wasn't that long ago and it wasn't that far away. Right. My grandma, who I talked to every single day, was there, and so that's part of the purpose of the book and part of the mission behind it now. And we see what's going on in our world is to educate, to enlighten, to spread the word about this history that, not enough people know about.
And people still try to say never happened.
Right. Yeah. There are, as we know all too well, so many Holocaust deniers. So yeah, we want to get it out there.
And that's actually something that really astounds me, and that's why, with my parents no longer here, I really, like, every chance I can, I talk about the family that saved her, who my sister and I are really close with to this day. I mean, of course, the people who saved my mother and grandmother are no longer alive, but their, grandchildren and great-grandchildren are. And it is so important to pass it down because, I know we use the words never forget so often, but, we look around us and the hateful messages coming at us today shows how important it is.
Yeah, I wrote something years ago for the Jerusalem Post about, the need to remember the Holocaust, of course. And there's a lot of troubling data about how little, especially the younger generations, know about the Holocaust in America. And I made a point, which I think stands today, because we always say never forget. But I think in this moment, we need to actively remember, right? It's not because forgetting is something that happens passively, right? I think something of this scale requires active remembrance at this point, right? And so again, me writing the book, speaking about the story, transmitting the history is part of that, because we turn on the TV, we see what's happening in our country with all the hate, we see what's happening in Europe right now with families being separated, mothers, fathers being killed. We know what's possible, right? We know what mankind is capable of, and look no further than what happened in the Holocaust. And so, yeah, for so many reasons, it's an imperative that people know what happened.
It's a great take on that. Great take on that. Your grandmother wasn't the only, Holocaust survivor. Your grandfather,
yeah,
well,
so
Alex.
That's right. So my grandmother, so she survived the Budapest ghetto. There were 10 siblings and two loving parents, big Orthodox Jewish family. And, in the book, I go to great lengths to detail their life before the war, because they didn't have running water. They had no electricity, but it was an idyllic childhood. My grandma still talks about it when she FaceTimes with me and my sons and my wife. And my sons, of course, are running amok and there's a lot of noise. And she says, that's music to me, because that was my home. The love of family. And she says, that's the house I grew up in. And 5 of her siblings, as I mentioned, were killed. Both of her parents were killed. And so that's the life she came back to. Her family house looted. My grandfather was in a forced labor camp in Hungary. And so he was liberated from the camp before my grandmother survived the Budapest ghetto, but he lost his sisters and he lost his parents. And so they both came back to decimated families. And, in researching the book, of course, I had asked my grandmother some really tough questions. And one thing I was interested in is how do you go on? How do you rebuild? How do you keep going after all that? And it really was about family, starting your own family. So my grandparents, this is actually an interesting story that you'll appreciate, because like you just did, they asked about, both of my grandparents, how'd they meet. The day my grandmother got back, all she had was a raggedy overcoat, a thin cotton dress, and some beat up shoes. That's what she was wearing in Budapest. And one of her brothers had survived, and he had been back for a few months. He'd been liberated from a working camp. And almost as soon as she got home, he said, hey, we need to get you some new clothes. Their whole house had been looted. Like I said, there was nothing left. He said, we need to get you some new clothes. I made a friend in the labor camp who's from this area and opened up a store nearby. Let's go get you some clothes. So it was that day that my grandmother walked through the doors of my grandfather's store. And so they met that day,
Wow.
and they quickly, got married and had my uncle. And then 8 years later, they had my dad.
Wow. I mean, yeah, strange thing, fate, but such a, hard way to have that happen, but meant to be, you
Yeah.
know, meant to be. Speaking of your dad, Ernie, he grew up in communist Romania and moved here when he was 9. Is that correct?
That's right. So yeah, after the Holocaust, my grandparents spent 2 decades, but my dad, was born and raised under communism in Romania, and just very brutal. And the Romanians were known for their brutality under communism. And my grandparents had friends who were jailed, tortured, or killed for even saying a word that wasn't the right word. That's how. I mean, there was no freedom. There was you couldn't possess anything. You couldn't earn anything. It just saps the human spirit, that way of living. And it took them more than a decade to get visas to leave Romania. And they were actually bound for Israel. It was the state of Israel that paid money for each Jew that the communists would allow to leave. And so when my dad was 8 years old, they left Romania on a train to Serbia and then to Rome. They had a 6-month stopover in Rome, and they were headed to Israel. But my grandfather wanted to come to the United States. He had heard of the opportunity. And my grandma still says, I could say no to your grandfather. That was not an issue, but I couldn't say no to your uncle. So my dad's older brother had been dating a girl in Romania who had also just gone to the States. And so he wanted to be in America. So my grandma said, if he wanted it, we were going to figure it out. And so they stayed in Rome. They eventually got, passport or green cards, I should say, to go to the United States. And they arrived in 1964. And my dad was 9 years old when they touched down.
Wow. And where did Dad's love of basketball begin?
So they get to America, and I saw like they're living the American dream already because they're in America. They have a chance to work. My grandparents, they have sons who can get an education, right? They can keep what they make. Right? These are things that they've never experienced before. A few months, and so I mentioned my uncle, my dad's older brother. Just to give you a little context, what my dad called my uncle in their native language, Hungarian, translates to English as my king. Right. So that just shows you how a little brother looks up to his big brother. By the way, my dad, when he got to America, spoke fluent Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian, didn't speak a word of English, and had never touched a basketball. So that's how he kind of arrives in the United States.
Wow.
My uncle was diagnosed with leukemia a few months after arriving, and he passed away within a year. So at 17 years old, after all this loss, my grandparents, they lose their oldest son, and my dad loses his brother. And I'm very honest about this in the book. I'm named after my uncle. His name was Lutzi in Hungarian, but Leslie in English. And my middle name is Leslie after him. And that's an obligation I carry, a history I carry. I've played basketball at Stanford, and, I drove myself very hard, and he's part of all that. He's part of me in that way. But that's the biggest tragedy. Despite all the loss prior to that for my grandparents and for my dad was, and by the way, still is crushing to lose a loved one like that at that moment. And so my dad, he was made fun of by kids because he didn't speak the language. My grandparents were Holocaust survivors. They had to work 6-7 days a week. It's tough. He was uprooted from his homeland. So he's in New York City. He went to the playgrounds, and what they did at the playgrounds was they played basketball. And my book is called By the Grace of the Game. And it's called that for a reason. Like, basketball shined its light on my family when we really needed it. And my dad, became larger than life at basketball. And I don't think he would have flown so far so fast had he not been moving away from such tragedy.
Wow. And you just struck me by just talking about them working 6 and 7 days, because that was very much, my father to support us.
Listen, and also, like, they weren't formally educated because of the Holocaust.
Correct.
They didn't speak the language. So imagine, right? They come to the United States and it's time to work. And so my grandfather's first job was painting houses in Connecticut. My grandmother got a job at a t-shirt factory in Brooklyn. They both kind of, like, my grandmother then worked at a watch band factory. And then they initially saved up the money and they got their own store. They opened up a fabric store in the Bronx, and that was their baby. That was their livelihood. And yeah, they just worked, man, because they had an opportunity to build a life, and they built a nice life.
It's incredible. Yeah, you made me think. My father did like a steam press when I think he first got here. My dad didn't have past, I think, fifth grade education because of the war. My mother
Right.
was lucky. She was younger, so she got to go back to school for a little while.
Okay.
But he was, a teenager during the war, so he missed out
Yes.
on.
Yeah, and there you are, steam press, whatever it takes, right? Like
Uh,
I mentioned, my grandpa was painting houses in Connecticut. He lived in Queens, New York. So like, it's not like it's around the corner, but like, you
and
got to
back then, it's
figure.
not so easy to get to where you need to, yeah.
Yes.
But
So
families
that was
did
their
what they
life.
needed to do to make it, to support each other.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Absolutely. But it was 10 years after immigrating here that your dad was standing on the podium at the 1976 Olympic Games. That's
Yeah.
pretty astounding.
The whole thing is astounding. It is, and so my dad just sometimes things just click. They make sense. Basketball was that for him. So and interestingly, and there's some really great stories in the book about this. My grandparents, they worked so much. They were loving, committed parents, but they didn't know what was happening. They were building this life, and they knew my dad played basketball a lot. He'd come home with some trophies, but they didn't exactly know. And I'll tell you the story that they got a call at their fabric store. This is my dad's junior year in high school. And I juxtapose in the book, my own experiences. I was born underprivileged, right? My dad was a player for the New York Knicks when I was born, and then he was the general manager of the team. My parents were, my mom was driving me to every game. My sister was at all my dad, his parents didn't even know he was, they knew he was playing basketball, but that was it. So his junior year, his high school coach called their store and said, you have to see your son play basketball. The reason they hadn't been to a game is because my dad's games were in the afternoon, and my grandparents would have had to close their fabric store to be there. They couldn't close the store. It was all about work. So the following week, they closed the store. They went to one of his games, but they didn't close it early enough. So when they got to the gym, the game had already started and the gym was full. So the usher at the door said, gym's full. We can't let you in. And so like my grandfather, their English wasn't very good. My grandfather said, we're guests of coach, we're parents of player, but said nothing we can do. The game's already started and it's sold out. And for whatever reason, my grandmother said, our son's name is Ernie Grunfeld. She just said that. And the guy at the door said, why didn't you say so? And he led him in the gym. And it's funny, my grandma's 97. She still tells this story. And they went into the gym and they looked around and my grandpa kind of nudged her. And in Hungarian, he said, well, if he's so good, why isn't he on the floor? And my grandmother grabbed his arm and said, look right there. That's Ernie in the middle of the court. And it's so symbolic. My grandpa couldn't even recognize my dad because this immigrant kid who was getting picked on, who didn't speak the language, now he's on a basketball court. And he's big. He was, as a senior in high school, he was 6'5", 225. Like he was a man amongst boys. And my grandpa could not recognize my dad. And my grandpa used to make my dad come to the fabric store to work on the weekends. And on the court after that game, he said, you never come to the store again. You just play basketball. We'll take care of the rest. And so the following year, he was an All-American. He was one of the most highly recruited players in the country. He went to the University of Tennessee. He was a 4-time All-SEC selection. He graduated as the school's all-time leading scorer, the second leading scorer in the history of the SEC behind Pete Maravich. And by the way, that was in 1977. Today, he's the 5th leading scorer in the history of the SEC. So he was larger than life. He was on the cover of Sports Illustrated with Bernard King, his teammate. And yeah, he got a chance to try out for the United States Olympic team after he had become a citizen, which is also an amazing story in the book because the national team got him a citizenship in 24 hours. He made the Olympic team. So my grandparents closed their store for 2 weeks and they drove from Queens, New York to Montreal, Canada, and watched my dad become a gold medalist for the United States. And so I wrote the book, man. It's just I grew up like knowing these stories and I'm like, this feels big, like this feels significant, right?
To know where your grandparents came from, it is huge, and all of it just is, inspirational, out of tragedy, really, and horror that to come
It
that
is.
far.
It's true. And like the story, it's very just reflective of what life is like, right? We laugh, we cry, there's joy, there's pain. And my family story has very much been that way. And the highs have been very high on the top of the Olympic podium, right? That's very high. My dad was a 11th pick in the NBA draft, 30 years as an NBA executive. Like there's a lot of really high highs, but then you're talking about the Holocaust, and you're talking about a young man dying tragically from cancer. Like, there's a lot of really low lows, and you deal with what life throws at you, and you can maintain hope and positivity and love, and that's what my grandparents always did, my dad also. And so that I always say, like, there's a lot of darkness in our story, but there's much more light, and it's been that, right? It's been hopeful for people, and that means a lot.
And sharing hope is the way to sort of, put a positive spin on the darkness, I guess.
That's right. Yeah, and you have to keep hope and keep positive.
Was there any doubt you would end up on the basketball court?
Not in my mind. Probably in other people's mind who might have seen me play at certain points. But no, I mentioned, like, being born into such different circumstances than my dad or my grandparents. When I was born, my dad was a player for the Knicks, and I was delivered by C-section. And so my parents planned my birth. So my dad, he went on one road trip and he was there for my birth. And then he went on another road trip and he was there for my bris. So quite literally, like, my arrival was planned around the NBA basketball schedule. So from the time, from as long as I could remember, that's what I wanted to do. I recall being in Hebrew school, and we were going around the room, and everyone was saying what they wanted to be when they grow up. And I was like, an NBA basketball player, and everyone laughed, and I get it, right? Not a lot of Jewish kids from the burbs, playing in the NBA. But for me, it was what I loved. It was what I knew. And it meant so much to our family, because even at a young age, I knew what basketball had done. I knew where my dad had come from and where he had ended up, and basketball's role. So it was always bigger than a game to me. So it's always what I wanted.
And it's kind of ironic that your first professional contract, you had to ask your grandmother for permission to sign that contract. Can you tell us?
Yeah.
I understand the permission asking.
Yeah. I write in the book, like, I'm probably the only professional basketball player to call his grandmother to ask permission to sign the first contract. But, I was kind of like borderline NBA overseas, and I saw that my career would start in Europe, and I was really excited about it. And my agent called me in the summer. He said, "Hey, got the perfect situation for you. Top team in the top league of Germany, which is a strong league." Oh, he said, no, he said top team in the top league in Germany. And as soon as he said Germany, I didn't even listen to the rest, right? Because I was like, oh boy. And so I said, listen, I have to call you back. And I called my grandma right away, and I told her the situation, and I'll never forget what she said. She said, "Sons are not responsible for the sins of their fathers," which is amazing, right? It shows her wisdom, her perspective. And she said, "You can't blame this generation of Germans for what that generation did." Because that's what people have done and continue to do to Jews, right? Blame us for things, make assumptions, and so you're not going to do that. You treat people fairly, get to know people for who they are, go experience the culture, enjoy the basketball element of it. And that's what I did. And it was a great experience. And I write in the book about my best friend on our team, who was a German national team player, my age, from Berlin. And we got very close, and we talked about towards the end of the year, my family's experiences in the war, but also his. They were on the other side of the war, and he was telling me about the guilt and the shame that his generation feels. And it was during the World Cup of Soccer 2006, and Germany hosted it, and they won it, actually. So it had just happened. So this was 2006, 2007. And he was telling me that it was the first time in his lifetime that he saw groups of Germans congregating and waving the flag. And it scared him, because it had always been discouraged, bordering on forbidden, because of their history, of the nationalism and what it led to. So he was just kind of opening up to me about his history, just as I was opening up to him about my own. So
I kind of wish that was on tape.
Yeah, it was moving. I mean, it was really deep, and he's a great guy, very good basketball player, by the way, but just a great, very deep guy. And we had deep conversations about it. Like, think about it, like, two descendants. I'm the descendant of Holocaust survivors. He's the descendant of Germans who were, doing things in that era. Mm-hmm. And here we are playing a game together, and we're very close friends. And this is life. These are the histories that we both share and that we're trying to reconcile.
Yeah, I mean, your grandmother, what she said to you is amazing, because, sadly, I don't think my mother ever got over, that. Like, I don't think she would have ever, she had trouble with us, traveling through Germany.
A lot of Jewish people
yeah.
are like that. And I I always tell people about Holocaust survivors and people with that trauma, like you just have to respect however they handle their and process their emotions, right? There are people who won't drive a Mercedes Benz. There are people who
Correct.
won't fly through Germany. There are like
Yeah.
you have to just let people heal and kind of process in the way that they need to.
Well, we were talking about mental health, backstage. If anybody needed uh, somebody to talk to, it was people who survived the Holocaust. Your grandmother, my parents, both your grandparents. Like what that kind of what they lived through, and nobody spoke about it really after the war for a long time.
It's true. Yeah, you couldn't imagine a situation that requires the type of support and this type of healing. And I think, to my point earlier, their therapy was restarting, rebuilding, like immersing yourself in a new life. And
Yeah.
so children came quickly, new families sprouted quickly, and yeah, they didn't talk about it much. And I know, of course, my book came out and I researched it for so long, so I know a lot. But even before I wrote the book, I knew so much more than my dad about my grandmother's experiences because he was so close to it. They never talked about it when he was a kid.
That's
I have a
interesting.
generation of separation, so I asked questions. We talked about it more, so I always knew more than him, even before writing the book.
So from what I understand, when you returned to the U.S. from Israel, you started putting the book together. Was there something that struck you at that particular moment that you thought, I need to put this, into a book?
It was really where I was at in my life. I love to write. I did a lot of writing when I was playing professional basketball. I had contributing writing positions to several websites, and I had published about 40 things that have done, not books, but like opinion pieces, essays that had done fairly well. And I love doing it. And like, if you want to write a book, I think, particularly a book like this, it just has to be in your heart. It's like you can't not write it. It takes so long and it's so hard emotionally. The work is hard. So much goes into it. The reward system that we think about, like money, fame, all those things, that's not what books are about. Books are about sharing them. And if all that stuff happens, that's wonderful, of course, but it happens so very rarely.
Right.
You have to write it for the reason that there's a story in your heart that you just can't keep in. And that's what this was to me. And so I just never had the space or the time, or it just wasn't the right time for me when I was playing. And if you read the book, you'll see that, because I was so focused and I put so much pressure on myself. And so listen, I carry a lot, and the game of basketball has done a lot for us. And also my dad was a great player. And so there's expectations and pressure. I dealt with all those things. We talk about mental health, right? Like I had my own struggles with just the game. And so, but then I retired and I went to business school, and it was like my time of growth and of exploration. And it didn't take long from the time I retired to the time I said, it's time to do this. Let's go. And then 5 years later, the book came out.
And I mean, you sat down with both of them, with your father, with your grandmother, and I'm sure, your grandmother's stories are what really lay the groundwork, talk about just because in some of these conversations I've had, I regret, like I wish I had more conversations with both of my parents. I am lucky they did the Shoah Foundation interview. Mm-hmm. So yep. I have some of that, but that's them talking to someone else.
Right.
And not just, I'm not talking Holocaust survivors, anybody who has the opportunity to sit with their 90-year-old grandmother, mm-hmm. or, whoever in their family, learn your story. But what was that like, hearing it from her and getting to ask, basically, it sounds like, anything you wanted?
Yeah, I did. I had to ask questions I never could have imagined asking. The interesting part was neither of them knew I was writing a book, and that was intentional. I wasn't keeping anything from them, but I think I said, I have a project in mind. I just want to document everything. And so I was in business school, and I would come from class and I would call my dad, and we'd talk for 45 minutes, and I would record it. I would transcribe it. I would do the same with my grandmother. But it wasn't for a book, right? It was just a conversation. I think that created space for them to be very honest. And it also created space for me, because it was difficult for everyone. But yeah,
There was
listen,
no pressure really,
there was no pressure.
Yeah.
It was recalling the history. Like let's get every detail about our family history down. And then and they know me. I'm always working on something here or there. So, but like we just talked, and yeah, I asked some really hard questions, about my uncle, and I learned details that I never would have learned had I not had this project in mind, because I just never would have asked the really hard questions. I'll give you an example. I mentioned my grandfather was painting houses in Connecticut, right? When they came and my uncle was sick. And towards the end, when my uncle was really sick, they knew he didn't have much longer. He was in the hospital. My grandfather still had to go because they had to have food on the table. And when he was really bad, my grandmother got in touch with him. This is before cell phones, of course. She got in touch with him and said, you need to get to the hospital immediately. He didn't have a car. He caught rides with friends. She has no idea how he got there so fast, but she said he got to the hospital like as if he were sitting in the car at that moment. But he took that to his grave. He passed away in 1986. She never found out how he got there so fast. And I asked her, I said, did he make it in time? Did he make it in time? And she said, no, which means my uncle passed before my grandfather was able to say his goodbyes. And that's crushing. It's so sad. But I'm glad I know it, because it's what happened and it's part of our history. And like, you have to know, but I never would have asked that. And and it's one of those details. And there was other things about the Holocaust I had. And I had a great aunt who was evaluated there by Dr. Mengele, which I didn't know before. Like, there was just all these details and all these things that you learn. And I'm very grateful to both of them for being so open and honest. And again, I think that's what's made the book's really resonated, and it's done well, and it's traveled far and wide. And I think that level of honesty and detail is a big part of that.
Well, and during your writing, you were up every day at 6 a.m.
Right.
I mean, that, determination to write.
First of all, it's 6:02 a.m. I had my alarm.
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask that. Why?
I'd be remiss not to correct. 6:02 a.m. every single day. Yeah, listen, I told my wife, I was like, if I'm going to do this, I have to do it like I did basketball. It's the only way. Like, you can't like for me, basketball, and you'll from the book, like it was not like it was everything, but it was almost everything. Like, it was just, you have to
when you make a commitment to sport like that, it's got to be. Otherwise, you wouldn't have, been offered that contract.
That's right. And like, listen, I was a student athlete at Stanford. I knew what it was like to be very focused on a few things. Like, I did well in the classroom. I did well on the basketball court. And so I had that discipline, that muscle I had built, and this meant the world to me. So I told my wife, like, I'm going to approach this like I did basketball, and we'll see where it takes me. And so I just set my alarm. I had the discipline to get out of bed, write for 2 hours every morning. And then in 8 months, after I did that year and a half of research, after 8 months, I had my first draft. And my wife said to me, I'm so proud of you. I, of course, thanked her. But I said, really, all I really did was I had the discipline to get my butt out of bed and not snooze and just like sit there every single day. And sometimes that was really fun because I was writing fun stuff. Sometimes it was really hard. Sometimes I just didn't have it. Regardless, just sit in front of the computer. And if you do that at scale for long enough, things will happen. So I have a lot, like, people reach out to me like, oh, I have a book in me, but da-da-da. And I always just say, just go forth. Just like, go forth. Put the time in, and like, you'll get somewhere.
Yeah, it's funny because what you were saying earlier about, having the passion for it, because I have a friend who's like a New York Times bestselling author, and talking about my family story, I had gone to her and said, like, should I do this? And she said, well, you have to be really passionate and know that you have the story in you to write it, and don't do it for any other reason. So it was interesting that you both said exactly the same thing. I heard you say about this book that you hope younger people who have not had the exposure to the Holocaust be given the chance to engage with it, wrapped around the basketball. Talk about, and you mentioned reaction has been positive, but I mean, being the child of Ernie and, being so close with your grandmother, what has the reaction meant to you, and having both of them to see it?
The reaction's been incredible, and it's been so meaningful. I mean, I get notes from all over the world. I've had very prominent people reach out. I've had, people like the whole spectrum. And it means an incredible amount because I put myself out there. I told a very honest story. I told an important story. It's my family's version of a universal story. We all have our histories, overcoming things, the people you love, the things you love, what life throws at you and how you deal with it. That's the story. But there's, this is my family's version. So that's been great. Having my grandmother and my dad, of course, be part of it has been really special. I spoke to my grandmother's retirement community, and I was able to tell them, like, you live with a hero. They love her, even though she's the best bridge player and she beats everyone. They love her, but they don't know. And she probably every week will tell me, oh, I was in the elevator and this person just read your book, and wow, they love, so like that's amazing. And it's cool. Like my dad's very private and the story is very difficult for him, but he gets people reaching out to him all the time about it as well. And he always shares it with me. And I know he's very proud. He's very grateful. Regarding what you said about younger people, it's hard to engage with the Holocaust. It's heavy. It's a heavy topic.
Mm-hmm.
And all the data around the younger generation has been the most troubling, how little they know about it. And I mean, it's really upsetting if you dig into the numbers and when they survey kids around the country. My book is not a Holocaust book. It's not a basketball book. It's a book about family. It's a book about life, but it has a lot of Holocaust history. It has a lot of basketball, and there's fun parts, there's funny parts. And so I've had a lot of like parents and even grandparents say, well, my 13-year-old, like they won't read anything, but they liked your book. And they read about the Holocaust. They know a Holocaust survivor now, right? And I'll speak to students and I'll say, how many of you have ever met a Holocaust survivor? And sometimes no hands go up. I said, well, you can read my book and you'll know one. So I encourage you to try to meet one in person, like whenever you can, or hear a Holocaust survivor speak, because it's very moving. But if you read my book, you'll know a Holocaust survivor. That's my grandmother, right? So like that's what it's all about. Again, books are not, it's not money stuff, and it's not fame stuff, and it's not attention stuff. It's the real stuff. And this is the real stuff.
Putting a face with a name.
Yeah. And putting a human being behind a historical event that's like, it's so impossible to wrap your mind around, especially for a youngster, that it's just like a thing that happened one time. Like these are people, these are human beings, and you get to know one of the most amazing human beings you'll ever get to know. And she was there and she survived it. And so that part of it is super meaningful. But then there's also the inspirational basketball part. We're like, yeah, like my dad's a hero in his own way. Like I have so many people from New York City where my dad kind of rose to prominence, write me about like, oh my gosh, like your dad is my hero. Like he's very low key and it's very behind the scenes. But for a Jewish guy, immigrant, kid of Holocaust survivors, he wore number 18 for the New York Knicks and then was the president and general manager of the team.
Well, and I love, tell people why number 18.
In Judaism, 18 is the most symbolic number. High, means to life. And like in the Jewish culture, 18, it's the most prominent, it's the most important number. And so
I was born a week ago on the 18th.
Well, first of all, happy birthday. That's a good omen.
Isn't it a good?
That's a good omen.
October 18th. I'm a very lucky Jewish.
No wonder you're such a good guy. And no, but like, yeah, for him, for the Knicks in New York City, the city that he's from Queens, New York. He became a basketball legend on the playgrounds of Queens. Played for the Knicks to end his career. Wore number 18. Again, that's why I wrote the book. Like once I put it all together, I'm like, man, this is some crazy stuff here. But I'm very proud of both of them.
NBA player with a connection to the Holocaust.
According to the research, he's the only athlete in the history of any of the major leagues in the United States. So Major League Baseball, NFL, NHL, and the NBA. He is the only one who has parents who are Holocaust survivors. And, it sounds like when people hear that, they're like, no way. Like it's such a big fact. But if you think about it, you had to come from Europe. You likely played in the 70s, 80s. Like, once you start doing the math, like, okay, there weren't that many players who came from Europe in the NBA at that era, period. then they were likely Jewish if you were affected by the Holocaust. Like, yeah, and I talked to all the history heads at all the leagues, and we did the research, and yeah, that's what it indicates.
Really amazing. And before I let you go, the foreword was written by one of NBA's 75 greatest players and a member of the Basketball Hall of Fame, Ray Allen. Tell us about, sort of what he wrote and the impact, Schindler's List had on him. And I'll just share quickly, Schindler's List for me was like an eye-opener as a Jewish kid who had Holocaust survivors as parents. So it's fascinating the impact it has on others.
Without a doubt. Like, Ray Allen is a global icon, right? Like, he's a top 75 player in the history of the NBA. He started, he got game next to Denzel Washington. Like, Ray is larger than life himself. And I'm lucky to have a relationship with Ray because my dad was the general manager of the Milwaukee Bucks when Ray was the star player. And I was an up-and-coming player in high school. I was a shooting guard. That was Ray's position. He was just very good to me. He would just give me pointers. He'd give me some shoes. Like, he's such a great guy. He didn't know at the time that my dad's parents were Holocaust survivors, and my family didn't know that educating on the Holocaust had become Ray's passion, because he saw Schindler's List, like you said, when he was in college at UConn, and it just struck him. And he said, this is not just a Jewish tragedy. This is a human tragedy, which it is. And he said,
100%.
It is. And he made it his mission to educate. And so every time his teams played in Washington, D.C., he would take teammates to the Holocaust Museum. And I've talked to some of those teammates, and they said, dude, it was like life-changing, because like they never had exposure. And Ray took his time on trips to play basketball to take his teammates to the Holocaust Museum. So President Obama appointed Ray to the board of the Holocaust Museum in 2016. That's like how, and he's been to Auschwitz. He's taking groups to Auschwitz. Like, he walks the walk. And so I connected with Ray, and he had no idea. He'd been to our house. Like, we shared meals and time. And he said, Ernie's parents? Like, and so when I asked him if he would stand by the story, he didn't hesitate. And he wrote such an incredible, really moving forward about what it means to him, how this story really represents something important in a history that folks should know. And so I've said this many times, and I mean it. And when I was in high school, I had a framed Ray Allen jersey on my wall. Number 34, Milwaukee Bucks. Like, he was the guy, right? He was the guy.
Pretty cool then to get him to write that.
Oh, it was amazing. And like, as much as I looked up to him then, I look up to him more now. And that's true, because to be a great basketball player is very cool, and you'll get a lot of fans, but to be a great person who has an immense platform and uses it for good is much more significant. And that's who Ray is. So I love the guy. He's unbelievable.
That's why I wanted to ask that last, because really, your book, Schindler's List, you and I having this talk, these are conversations that people can learn something they didn't know anything about, and do, like I said in the open, change course, help stop hate in all its form,
No doubt. And like, they say, like, if you save a person, you save the world. And like, you never know who's listening. You never know when I talk to, especially young people, because they're the most impressionable, like, you never know how you can influence someone to take the right path and to learn the right things and to treat everyone with fairness and justice and respect, right? And it doesn't seem like that hard of a concept. Just get to know people for who they are and treat them with respect. Of course, as a society, as a humanity, we fail a lot to devastating consequences, but for us having this conversation, maybe one person listens who buys this book for their young niece or nephew who didn't know about the Holocaust, and then like, this is what impact is. And so we're doing our small part.
And if we had to say it clearly again, what because I have said this in many of these conversations with Alan, but he who saves a life saves the world. I mean, the impact of that to me is just astounding.
Yep. No, it's true. And it empowers you. Yeah. Because listen, like Ray Allen, his platform is millions. So he can do a lot. Like you or I, like we have platforms, not in the millions, right?
Yeah,
but it's like, hey, all it takes is one. Like what, and I've had that with the book where I've really had people reach out to me with serious things that were happening, and the story that this book tells moved them, changed something, impacted something. And like, that's why you do it. That's what it's all about.
Couldn't think of a better ending right there, Dan. Thank you so much for spending the time with me and sharing your story.
No, thank you, Alan. This was great. I really appreciate it.
Same here. You stay well.
You too. Thank you.
Kiss those boys goodnight.
Oh yeah, I'll do that. Thanks.
Bye. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Dan Grunfeld. Don't forget, everybody, if you haven't, please pick up Dan's book, By the Grace of the Game, where all books are sold. As I leave you tonight, remember, we all have choices to make in life. Speak up, do the hard things, and let's all fight to stop hate in all its forms. I truly believe conversations like this can change our world around us. Stay tuned for the next conversation.